is the foundational science and art, it's a combination, for the research of any ancient literature whose original is lost. When it comes to Greco-Roman literature, there are no originals. So we have to do that. And it was considered to be the scholarly task of all scholars who worked in any kind of ancient literary text, that's the first task that they should do. Nowadays, we have textual critics who've been around doing this task for a long, long time. And so normal exegetes, scholars, even professors of the Greek New Testament tend not to do that. They just rely on these texts. But the textual criticism, the definition for any ancient literature is, the goal of it is to try to get back to the original wording of a text whose original no longer exists, or we don't know where it is. And for the New Testament, it's for our New Testament. We don't have the originals anymore. They disappeared. I think they all disappeared by the end of the 2nd century because they were copied so much that they just frayed and shredded and disappeared. But there's a secondary goal of also looking at these variants throughout history as kind of a social window on the Christian communities that created the text and used their own for whatever reasons. When you think about textual criticism, you think in terms of two divisions of evidence. One is called external evidence, and the other is internal evidence. External evidence is the materials that are out there, and they're broken into three groups: Greek manuscripts, versions or translations of the text in other languages, and quotations of the text by the church fathers. And the church fathers wrote in Greek and Latin and some in Syriac, but those three groups give us just a massive amount of evidence so that we have what's been dubbed an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the New Testament text. Now, when you think about the external evidence, these three groups, there's three ways to attack the evidence as well. The first is when you're especially wrestling with the manuscripts, you're thinking of the date and character of the manuscripts. What's the age of the manuscript? Generally speaking, the older the manuscript, the fewer copies between it and the original. That's not always the case. Sometimes later manuscripts go back hundreds of years for the single copy they're going back to. And then the character. And we're looking at a couple things. Is the scribe careless? Is he careful? And is the tradition he's copying from careless or careful? And the Germans, Kurt and Barbara Ahlon, wrote a book called The Text of the New Testament that's been a standard for many years now, where they distinguish between a careful tradition and a careful scribe. And so if you have a careful scribe in a careful tradition, man, that's a win-win. And that's what we really like to see. But that's date and character. And then you look at genealogical solidarity. And that has to do with the manuscripts within a particular textual family. How much do they agree on a particular variant? Because what we're really dealing with, and I like this way of doing textual criticism, is you can see that these manuscripts fit into clusters that we might call families. They used to be called text types. Now that term is kind of passé, but that go back to what you might call a regional original. Now, it doesn't mean that it was a recension or something like that, but in different areas of the Mediterranean world, they would have certain ways of copying. And so we see at least three different groups of manuscripts, the largest groups known as the Byzantine, Alexandrian, and Western. And so when you're looking at genealogical solidarity, you're looking at the solidarity of those manuscripts that belong to the Western text form or the Alexandrian or the Byzantine. Since you don't have the local originals of those, the regional originals of those, you're trying to determine the wording of that original. And so, for example, if you had 10 manuscripts that talked about a football game between now the LA Rams and the Dallas Cowboys, and it said that in 9 of these manuscripts it said, newspaper articles, for example, in 9 of them it says that the LA Rams beat the Dallas Cowboys 49-0. And the 10th one says that the Cowboys beat the Rams 49-0. And that 10th one is produced in Dallas. Mm-hmm. And the other 9 are produced all over the country. Well, you'd say, well, we've got some genealogical solidarity here. It looks like one of these is motivated to change the text. And once again, the Cowboys lose to the Rams. It always should be. But that's genealogical solidarity when it's within a group. But then you've got geographical distribution, and that's where you've got it spread out in a different region. So let's say you have a church father from the 3rd century in Antioch or Alexandria, and then you have a manuscript from the 3rd century in another part of the world, and then you have a version, say, from Rome, 3rd century. You have this Mediterranean region that's spread out, and they all have the same wording. That tells us that they can't have come up with that by collusion, because they're too disparate both in their text forms and their geographical regions. So they must go back to an earlier manuscript. The goal of textual criticism is to try to get back to the original text, but the best way to do it is by the confluence of thinking through genealogical solidarity, geographical distribution, and date and character of manuscripts. One of these readings is the original, and the others are derived from it either directly or indirectly, and so that's how we try to figure that out. So that brings us to internal evidence, and that has 2 categories: intrinsic probability and transcriptional. Now, intrinsic evidence is wrestling with not the material itself, but the text that's in the material, the wording of the material, if you will. Intrinsic evidence has to do with what is the author likely to have written, the biblical author. Transcriptional has to do with what is a scribe likely to have done. And we know what scribes did by the errors that they make in the text, the changes that they made to the text. There's a whole catalog of these. We've discussed a few of them, unintentional and intentional, but there's 15, 20 different kinds of errors. One classical scholar said the scribes could have made an unimaginable number of errors because scribes do. And so there's some that we simply can't explain. We say, I don't know why he came up with this, but that's what he did. Fatigue, or horses in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, really ridiculous readings at times. So intrinsic evidence, we're looking at what would the author be likely to have written. And we're comparing what he says in one place, both with what he says elsewhere, and it has to do with his vocabulary, his syntax, his style, his theological perspective, and the context. And then we look at transcriptional probability, and these sometimes play against each other, because the scribes, if they knew the author well, would sometimes want to change the wording of a manuscript in front of them, their exemplar, to conform to what they think the author said elsewhere. Let me give a simple illustration. In Mark's gospel, we have what's called the historical present. That's the use of the present indicative for a past tense. And the most common verb is legi, he says, and archetai, so he comes or he goes. We have 151 historical presents in the Gospel of Mark. Now, that's proportionally, it's far more than any other gospel. And a scribe comes along and he sees the aorist tense, "ipen," which is he said in the past tense, and he may subconsciously say, well, Mark's style is to put in legi. Or he may even consciously do this. If he's copying several words at a time, 3 or 4 words at a time, he's got to look at his exemplar, hold it in memory while he's writing it out with very archaic pens that don't do what our modern pens can do, and you have to keep redipping the ink and things. And he may have forgotten. And so we have variants like that conform to the author's style, but they're sometimes found in just a few manuscripts, late manuscripts, and so it's just a scribal blunder of just a brain fart, if you will. And so transcriptional evidence often shows us the same thing as the author's style, but that is also an error that a scribe made. It's those things that are not quite so subtle, but are much more frequent for the author's style that do that. Let me give an illustration of all of this, how it works. In John 1:18, we read that no one has seen God at any time. The unique one, himself God, has revealed him. Or it says, no one has seen God at any time. The one and only Son has revealed him. So is it the unique one, himself God, or the one and only Son? In Greek, the difference is one word, actually. Both variants have monogenes, which is the word unique or one and only, and it can be used as a noun, so the one and only one or the unique one, or it can be used as an adjective. And then most manuscripts have son after that. Some manuscripts have God, the unique one himself God, or the unique son. Now, the difference between those two words, God and son, is actually just two letters in Greek. But in some manuscripts, in fact, some of our oldest manuscripts, it's really the difference of one letter, because this would be a nomen sacrum, a sacred name that was abbreviated with a bar over it, and they would typically put just the first and last letter. So you'd have theta upsilon, or theta sigma, and upsilon sigma. And so just the difference between a theta and upsilon. So it's possible that scribes could have made a mistake by seeing that. But at the same time, we never see elsewhere in John's gospel the unique one himself, God. It's always monogenes huios, not just in John, but we see that in 1 John as well. Scribes who knew John's letters and his gospel intimately would naturally change God to son here. This is the only place in his gospel and his letters where you have that as a variant, but it's a very ancient variant. It's found in some of our oldest manuscripts. It's found in 2 early papyri, and it's found in Codex Sinaiticus, as well as some Latin manuscripts and others. So it has early evidence, date and character seems to fit. It has evidence that is in across the board in different regions, so geographical distribution fits. And when you look at the internal evidence, a scribe would tend to change it to son instead of God, because they would do that elsewhere from John. And the intrinsic evidence argues that in the Johannine prologue, which starts out by calling Jesus God, there's a kind of an inclusio where he starts out by saying one thing, he ends by saying the same thing. The unique one himself, God, really fits. And again, the very fact that you don't have variants elsewhere for the unique son tells us that why would scribes create it here? This must surely go back to the original, is how I would take that. So that's how you put all this together. If one exemplar, a regional original, is copied in almost a scriptorium where this is what they do for their living, and it has, say, 20 copies made of it directly from that manuscript that then get disseminated out to the Mediterranean world, and another exemplar of the same age has 2 copies because it's in a poor scriptorium, or maybe 20 copies were made, but most of them were destroyed by Muslim invasions, which really happened especially in the Middle East, or by fire or something like that. Those 20 copies that exist from that one exemplar are not worth 20 votes, while the other one only has 2 votes. Each of them is worth 1 vote, that regional original. And what we do know is that the Byzantine manuscripts look so much like each other, and they are the later manuscripts, and far and away the majority, 80 to 90% of our manuscripts fit what's called the Byzantine text form. And we know of a couple of periods where they really edited it highly, and it may go back to some kind of a regional original or a transmission stream of regional originals. But that doesn't mean that therefore if I have 1,000 manuscripts that say one thing and 4 that say something different, that's 1,000 votes to 4. You weigh manuscripts. You don't count them. You weigh it in terms of its date and character and how it fits into its text form and the internal evidence, whether it looks like it has superior readings. This is one of the things that the scholars Westcott and Hort did back in 1881. They wrote a book that was a game changer. Greek New Testament, then they wrote another volume on introduction and appendix that fit this. Hort spent 28 years of research on this project. And what he discovered was that overall, if you look at manuscripts and you see places where you have moral certainty as to what the original wording is, that this wording must have given rise to this wording over here. Over and over again, he would do that. He'd look at the manuscripts and he'd say, oh my goodness, every time it's these manuscripts. It happens to be Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus that typically had those readings. Now, he starts by looking at the internal evidence, and maybe 7 out of 10 places he said, yeah, this is what the original must have said. Then he sees what manuscripts have it, and that's not exactly his method, but you get the idea. And so he's saying, these are the manuscripts that we know have the original in this place. Now, in 3 out of 10 places, it's much harder to tell what the original is. It could be this or it could be this. The internal evidence can go either way. So that's when you have to rely on the manuscripts that have a proven pedigree. And that's why manuscripts are weighed instead of counted. Let me give one other illustration. We have over 10,000 manuscripts in Latin from the handwritten period up until the time of the printing press. The vast majority of them are copies of the Vulgate that we know Jerome produced in the late 4th and early 5th century. That means they all go back to one manuscript. It's not 10,000 copies that go back to the earliest 2nd century form of the Latin New Testament. Most of these are copies of the late 4th, early 5th century document. And that's recognizing that. We recognize that about Jerome. A lot of people don't seem to recognize it about the Byzantine text, that it goes back to an earlier form. We don't have evidence of the Byzantine text existing at all before the 4th century. So probably that's when it arose. One of the key criteria for determining what the original wording of the New Testament is in any given place is the more difficult reading is to be preferred to the easier reading. It's been a principle in place for hundreds of years now. By more difficult, we mean that it is more difficult in terms of the syntax in particular. It might be not as explanatory or as clear. It may be more ambiguous. Those are the issues that tell us that. But a reading can be more difficult in the sense that it looks like nonsense. That would be the most difficult reading. And so this principle implies we're only dealing with readings where one variant is an intentional change from the other. So, for example, when the New Testament authors quote from the Septuagint or the Old Testament, the more difficult reading would be the one that doesn't quote it exactly as we have it in our Septuagint. Why would a scribe change it that way? Scribes would want to conform to the form of the Septuagint. A more difficult reading when it comes to the Gospels would be those that don't harmonize as much as those that do. And so those are the kinds of things that constitute more difficult readings. And they should be preferred unless you can come up with an unintentional reason for why it came about. Scribes did add things intentionally. And when they left things out, that was usually unintentional, but not always. And consequently, if there's an intentional change, those are the ones that are the hardest to detect because they make sense. But when a scribe leaves something out, those don't typically make sense as much, whether you've dropped a word that is necessary for the context, something like that. So we would say that scribes, as far as intentional variants are concerned, tended to add. Scribes rarely tended to omit intentionally. But a good place where that happens is in Matthew 27, 16, and 17, where Pilate says, "Whom shall I release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, the one who's called Christ?" There are just a few manuscripts, but an important group of them, that says, "Whom shall I release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus, the one who is called Christ?" And most manuscripts omit the name Jesus before Barabbas. There's an intentional reason for that. They don't want that name associated with a criminal. They only want it associated with their Lord. And even Origen he was a brilliant textual critic in the 3rd century, but he makes a stupid comment about this. He said, "Well, there's no evil person who's ever named Jesus." So, well, that's not true. But here is a place where scribes intentionally omitted, but they typically intentionally add explanatory material. They'll add whole verses. We've talked about John 5:4, which was explanatory based on what the long tradition of visiting the Pool of Bethesda was about. But it wasn't really what was going on with the Pool of Bethesda. They'll add sometimes more than one verse. And there's 2 places where they add 12 verses. So that is the basic thing we see with these scribes. However, let me add this as well. The New Testament is a very conservatively copied book because over the 1,400 years of copying before the time of the printing press, it has grown in the Greek New Testament approximately 2%. That's how much more material has been added. Now, if you take a snowball and roll it down a hill and it goes on for a few hundred yards, it's going to get a lot bigger by the time it gets down there. and it have a lot of things that are not original. And so what we're trying to do with the New Testament is burn off the dross to get to the gold. And that means we're getting rid of these extra verses that were added, but it's only 2% more material over 1,400 years. No economist would say that's a good investment. It hasn't changed that much, but it has changed. There are two passages that are quite lengthy that involve textual variants. One is the ending of Mark's gospel. It either ends at Mark 16, verse 8, or at Mark 16, verse 20, 12 verses. There's actually 5 different endings that have been put at Mark's gospel, but if it ends at verse 8, then what we've got is the angel told the women to go and tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, and they did nothing because they were afraid, period, end of story. The gospel ends in a real downer. Mark's gospel is the only gospel, if that's the case, if that's the ending, that does not have any resurrection appearances by Jesus. In all 4 gospels, he is raised from the dead. But in Mark's gospel, at verse 8, we don't yet have him witnessed by any of the disciples. So I'd say it was a natural development for scribes to want to add some kind of a resurrection appearance. And so there were different endings that were added to this. But the one that finally won out, and it was produced very early on, I think in the 2nd or 3rd decade of the 2nd century, is the one that has these 12 verses. And the vast majority of manuscripts today have verses 9 through 20. We only have 2 Greek manuscripts that don't. But when you look at other ancient versions, you see that a number of them don't have that long ending, or they have the short ending before the long ending. There's a short ending, it's an intermediate ending that we don't see in our published modern translations, but they would not have put that short ending in if they already had the long ending. So they must have had an ancestry where they didn't have that long ending. And we have church fathers like Eusebius and Jerome and Victor of Antioch, and these 3 tell us something about the development of the text. In the early 4th century, Eusebius is producing these Bibles for Constantine, and he talks about the ending of Mark's gospel. And he says, I have found virtually no manuscripts that have anything after verse 8. Obviously, he didn't use verse numbers. They had not been created yet, the numbering system. And there are a few manuscripts later who say Eusebius canonized the Gospel of Mark to this point, at verse 8. They'll put it in the margin. And they'll say, but others have this. And so even a lot of the manuscripts that have the longer ending will refer to Eusebius's canonization up to verse 8. So in his day, and he has the wealth of Constantinople behind him while he's producing these Bibles, and he had Origen's library, which was an incredible library. He couldn't find manuscripts, very, very few manuscripts that had anything after verse 8. Now, later, towards the end of the 4th century, Eusebius is towards the beginning, towards the end of the 4th, early 5th, you have Jerome writing almost the same thing, but he adds one key point. He says, I have found that long ending in virtually no Greek manuscripts. And that may suggest that the variant came from a non-Greek text. I don't know. But Jerome is saying something different. He's not just mimicking Eusebius, and he has the support of the Vatican behind him. So you've got these 2 ancient scholars who have the greatest backing in terms of having access to manuscripts of any ancient patristic writers, and both of them say, I can hardly find that long ending. Now, move a little bit later to the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century, Victor of Antioch, who wrote the only commentary on Mark's gospel in the first millennium. And it became the most popular commentary on Mark until the time of the printing press. And he says, I have found this long ending in about half the manuscripts, and the short ending in about the other half. But I prefer the long ending. So here by the 6th century, the long ending was growing in popularity, and then it grew in popularity much, much later. So you can see through the patristic writers what's going on with the ending of Mark's gospel. That ending does not fit, the long ending does not fit Mark's style. It doesn't fit his vocabulary. It doesn't fit his syntax. The church fathers are against it. The earliest manuscripts don't have it. We've already shown you Codex Vaticanus and where it has that gap there. Not a gap to say, put this ending in here, it wouldn't have fit, but a gap to say there's a difference in genre, I think, coming next. And so the evidence is overwhelmingly against that ending being authentic. The other long passage is John 7:53 through 8:11. This is the story of the woman caught in adultery. And I'd say that that's my favorite passage that's not in the Bible. It's a variant that is also 12 verses long, and it's one that everybody loves. I've heard preachers preach on it saying, I know this may not be authentic, but I'm going to preach on it anyway. We all love it. The problem with this passage is that it's found in only one or two Greek manuscripts before the 9th century. And about 20% of all of our manuscripts don't have it. The earliest manuscripts don't have it. We have early papyri that don't have it, and no papyri that do. Then we have our earliest Greek manuscripts, and most of our Greek manuscripts through the 8th century don't have it. The vocabulary is not John's. The syntax is not John's. The style is not John's. There's no patristic commentary on it for 1,000 years. And it's a floating text. It is found in at least 6 different places. It's the kind of a passage that some scribe wanted to put into the Bible, but wasn't sure where it should go. There's 3 different places in John 7. It occurs between Luke and John. It occurs at the end of the 4 Gospels. It occurs after Luke 21:38 in a whole family of manuscripts. Recently, a man by the name of Kyle Hughes published an article in Novum Testamentum, one of the great New Testament journals. And he argued that there were 2 different forms of this story of the woman caught in adultery, which we've known about for a few decades. And he said there was a form that Luke had access to. And he stripped out the non-Lucan features, and he found the form that Luke's form would have been. And he said, it's not a woman caught in adultery. She's just caught in some sin. It's not the elders peeling out from the oldest to the youngest, but certainly they picked up stones to stone her, and Jesus rode in the dirt. There's a lot of features. He said these would have fit Luke's gospel. And he said it would have gone in after Luke 21:38. Now, he happens to be, Kyle Hughes is a former student of mine, and he wrote 2 papers on this that I urged him to write, and I suggested this as a possible term paper, which got published. He was a master's student and went on for his doctorate. And I think he solved the problem of the story of the woman caught in adultery. It comes from Luke's gospel. It ended up on the cutting floor because it wasn't that interesting, because it doesn't have all the stuff that was thrown together between a conflation of 2 different stories, one in the East and one in the West. If you ask most people, they would say, given the choice between having the long ending of Mark or the story of the woman caught in adultery, if you could only have one in your Bible, which one is it? Hands down, the majority always says we'd rather have the story of the woman caught in adultery. The problem is that the evidence against it is far greater than the evidence against the long ending of Mark. And so our faith has to be based on evidence, not on emotion. There's a lot of fascinating texture variants that we have in the Greek New Testament, and a lot of them that are very significant. So let me just mention a few. Let me turn to Mark 1:41 as a first one, which has been only recently wrestled with in terms of what the original reading might be. There's been a kind of a consensus against it for a long time, and now there's kind of some scholars moving in the other direction. This is the healing of a leper in Galilee. And in my Greek New Testament, it says, after the leper comes to Jesus, and Jesus has been preaching in synagogues, this leper comes to him and says, if you're willing, you can heal me. And verse 41 says, and showing compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I am willing, be healed. And immediately the leprosy left him. Now, where it says, and showing compassion, he stretched out his hand, that word showing compassion is one word in Greek, splanknes thais. There's a variant, which is orgus thais, which means, and becoming indignant, becoming angry, he stretched out his hand and said, I am willing, and healed him. It's found in Codex D, which is our most eccentric manuscript, but it has very early readings. And it's found in the Diatessaron and some other ancient documents go back to the 2nd century. It has some minimal evidence, but very significant evidence on its behalf. But when you look at the internal evidence, I mean, all the rest of the manuscripts have showing compassion. When you look at the internal evidence, what's significant here is why would scribes change Jesus showing compassion to Jesus being angry? There's no reason for them to do that intentionally. And some have suggested, well, they did it unintentionally because isthys is the ending for both of them. And so they may have mistaken splonknesthys and orgasthys and got them confused. No scribe worth his salt is going to be confused about those and then say Jesus was angry. But he might say Jesus was compassionate accidentally, but it's not going to go in the other direction. In Mark's gospel, we have two other places where Jesus gets angry, Mark 3:5 and Mark 10:14. And in both places, Matthew and Luke don't say that he's angry. Now, what's interesting here is the parallels with Matthew and Luke, and both Matthew and Luke have the same passage, the same pericope. They don't say that Jesus was compassionate. If Mark originally said that Jesus was compassionate, we would expect at least Matthew or Luke also to say that. If Mark originally said Jesus was angry, we would expect both Matthew and Luke not to say that. The fact that they say that Jesus was not compassionate, or not that they said nothing about his compassion, indicates that maybe Mark's original said Jesus was angry. There's another reason to argue that his anger is what's seen here, and that's because what he was angry at is difficult to determine. Bart Ehrman gives like a dozen different suggestions, but there's one that he doesn't suggest. And I think that might be what's going on here, but I'm not sure. I mean, it's ambiguous. It's hard. I mean, Mark writes in a way that at times is frustrating because we don't know what he means, and this may be one of them. But Jesus has been preaching in the synagogues in Galilee, and then all of a sudden this leper comes to see him. Where was this leper? He may well have been in one of those synagogues. If so, he's in violation of the law, and he's defiling other people. And so he comes to Jesus in the synagogue and says, hey, if you're willing, you can heal me. And Jesus is ticked. You've just broken the law. You defied all these people. I am willing. Be healed for both the leper's sake and for the others. But he was angry at him for defiling the law, for disobeying the law. That may well be what's going on here. We just don't know. But Ehrman wants to spin this in a direction of saying this is the human Jesus. He's very human and he's not divine. And he just gets ticked at people, and that's why he does his miracles. He has some kind of screwy exegesis at this point. But I think he's right that this is the original reading. The NIV 2011 has this reading now because of Gordon Fee's influence. And I was the senior New Testament editor for the Net Bible. We didn't have it in our first edition that came out in 2005, but I suggested it for the second edition, which has not come out, that we need to go with this reading as well. So that's a fascinating textual problem. And I'd say still most scholars don't think that's the case, that Jesus was angry. But most commentators who are really wrestling with the text say, yeah, it has to be, that has to be the original. Another one that I think is significant is Matthew 24:36. And let me just read that. I'll mention just a couple that are really interesting to me. But Matthew 24:36 says, now concerning that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son except the Father alone. That's in my Greek New Testament. I think nor the Son, neither the angels nor the Son, the words nor the Son are not authentic. They're not found in a number of manuscripts. They're not found in the majority of manuscripts as well as a few early manuscripts. They have a sufficient pedigree that it could go back to the original of having that omission. And when you compare this to the parallel in Mark 13:32, I think what's really interesting is what Mark has to say. And he says, now concerning that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, except the Father. Nor the Son is found in virtually all the manuscripts. We know of two late manuscripts that don't have it, one in Greek, one in Latin. Now, does Matthew have nor the Son like Mark does? What Matthew does with his Christology is almost always, he's using Mark's gospel, I believe, and almost always where Mark is asking a question, Matthew makes a statement. And so you've got in Mark's gospel, for example, we have this rich young ruler that comes to Jesus, and he says, good teacher, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus says, why do you call me good? In the parallel in Matthew, he says, teacher, what good thing must I do to be saved? Why do you ask me about the good? Mark is getting his readers to decide, is Jesus really good, because Jesus goes on and says only one is good. And he says that in Matthew's gospel too. I think Matthew changed the text to not raise the question about Jesus' deity. Instead, he's teaching. Now, it's not changing it essentially, because it's still, why would he ask a bad teacher what's good? And Jesus goes on and says only one is good. So Matthew has changed it to clarify the Christology that they should believe in. And Mark leaves it as a question because he wants these disciples who are being persecuted, these readers being persecuted, to really own their belief in Christ. That's why he ends at Mark 16:8 with the women being afraid and not sharing the gospel. And earlier, Jesus says, you got to pick up your cross and follow me daily. So it's all this pattern of true discipleship means sacrifice your life, consider it to be dead, and follow Jesus profoundly and deeply. Now, in Matthew 24:36, if nor the Son is authentic, we have a real problem, because Matthew adds one word that's not found in Mark, and that's the word only with the Father. Mark has except the Father. Matthew has except the Father alone. This would be the only place in all of Matthew's gospel where his Christology is, you might say, it's more explicitly at a lower level. It's doubly saying Jesus doesn't know. But if it's not there, if nor the Son is not there, then Matthew is saying something implicitly that Mark is saying explicitly. When Matthew says, not even the angels except the Father alone, Mark is saying neither the angels nor the Son except the Father. That would fit with Matthew's style of writing everywhere else we see. And so I'd say nor the Son is not authentic in Matthew. And by the way, this is Bart Ehrman's #1 proof text of early Orthodox corruption, where they took out nor the Son. And yet, the style fits Matthew not to have it. It fits for him to have a higher Christology, a more explicitly higher Christology, or to soften those statements that look confusing everywhere in his gospel. And so I'd say, no, I think Ehrman got this wrong. Nor the Son is not authentic in Matthew. So those are the kinds of variants. Let me mention just one last one. Revelation 13:18. The number of the beast. Is the beast 666? Well, everybody knows the Antichrist is 666. Well, not so fast. In the 2nd century, Irenaeus talked about, he had a whole chapter on the number of the beast. He said, yeah, the number of the beast is 666. I've seen this in older manuscripts, but there are some manuscripts that have 616. This is in the 2nd century, within 100 years, probably within 75, 80 years of when John wrote Revelation. Both kinds of readings existed. Now, up until 1998, we only knew of one manuscript that had 616, and that was Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, an early 5th century manuscript that Konstantin Tischendorf deciphered back in 1843 and 44. He spent 2 years working on this manuscript, 157 leaves, and it's a palimpsest. The top text was written in Ephraim's sermons, and what somebody had done is scraped off that undertext. It's a parchment manuscript where you can't read it. And then Ephraim, or somebody wrote out Ephraim's sermons on top. So it's very, very difficult to read that undertext. But in the 1830s, the syndics of the library had a chemical bath given to the manuscript. So every page is blue, and it brought out that undertext. Tischendorf comes along, and he's the first one ever to read virtually all of that undertext. It took him 2 years, though. He read 99% of it. And clearly, at Revelation 13:18, it says the number of the beast is 616. That happens to be one of our most important manuscripts of Revelation now, one of the best texts. But it was still the only manuscript we knew of, plus the ones that Irenaeus talked about that we didn't have anymore. Then in 1998, 17 New Testament papyri were published that were all at Oxford University. And one of these happens to be the oldest manuscript of Revelation 13:18. And it has, at this passage, the number of the beast is 616. Now, I had the privilege of looking at that manuscript, that papyrus, in 2002. And I had the privilege of looking at Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus in 2009. So I've seen both manuscripts, and I can affirm under a microscope, looking at it very carefully, there's no changes, no erasures. That's what it said in the original of each of those manuscripts. Our oldest manuscript and one of our most important manuscripts have 616. You can see why scribes would want to have the number of the beast as 666, in that he never gets to perfection. 0.666 ad infinitum is always 2/3. It never hits number 7. But this is the best man can do. So that may be a reason why scribes had that. It also seems to fit with a number of other things, but 616 it fits better with what's called a gematria, where these numbers have a letter equivalent, and it's the equivalent of Nero's name. Or I should say, Neron Caesar has the equivalent of 666, but spelled without an N on the end. Nero Caesar, which would be the normal spelling, equals 616. So I can see why early scribes would want to have 616 here, because it fits what's called the Nero redivivus myth, that Nero would rise again from the dead. But that myth went away in the 2nd century. Why would scribes after the 2nd century want to have that? So I go back and forth. It depends what day it is. If it's Tuesday, I think it's 616. If it's Wednesday, it's 666. Most scholars, however, would say, 616, no, that's not the number of the beast. The number of the beast is 666. 616, that's the neighbor of the beast. He lives a few doors down. But I'm not sure. So I can't say we have in our hands today, in every single respect, the original Word of God. This is the Word of God, but is every word the Word of God? That's a different issue. So that's a favorite variant. It's fun to wrestle with, and I don't know the answer to it.